To the survivors of sexual harassment and violence, I hear you, we hear you. We acknowledge your pain, and your courage is commendable. Your lived experience is valued. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing your stories. As was mentioned, today we remember the 14 young women in Montreal who were victims of the most extreme form of gender-based violence. These women were killed precisely because they were women by a man who claimed to be fighting feminism. Quite apart from that extreme form of gender-based violence, far too many women and vulnerable people continue to live silently with the prospect that they could be harassed, assaulted, or even gravely harmed because they are women and girls or from a vulnerable population. We, as women and girls, still face significant structural, institutional inequalities, and these inequalities too often allow violence and misogyny to manifest. For persons from vulnerable or marginalized groups, such as many Indigenous peoples, it is also true. And if female, it is compounded. But I, like all of you, am one for breaking down barriers. So let's get started. Sexual harassment and violence must stop. We must break past patterns of behavior. It does not matter if it is in the home, on the streets, in our schools, or in our workplaces. It does not matter if it comes from a lover, a family member, a friend, a colleague, or an employer. Sexual harassment, sexual violence is deplorable, and it must end. Sexual harassment is not just having fun. It's not just how it is. Sexual harassment is unacceptable, and the days of victim shaming are over. Victims are not just sensitive. They do not lack a sense of humor, and they're not just feminists. When a harasser is denounced, we are not ruffling feathers or creating a stir. We are ending violence. The tacit enabling of harassers through silence is utterly unacceptable. Each and every one of us has a role to play. All peoples of all genders must find their voice and acknowledge their role in stopping this conduct. To do this, we must all open our eyes to the prevalence of sexual violence and harassment, their insidious forms, and the devastating consequences they have for individuals, families, and communities. Together, we must turn this page into history. Each and every one of us is responsible for what happens next. What will you say when someone makes a comment, a derogatory comment, in the lunchroom, at the conference table, or in a locker room? What will you do if your boss disparages your colleague on the basis of their gender? How will you react if your friend tells you that they were groped at a Christmas party? Will you believe them and help to protect them from retaliation? A brave person can stand up to his or her enemies, but it takes true courage to stand up for your friends or superiors. Will you? Silence creates a culture of complicity. Cultures of harassment exist because people do not hold others accountable of unacceptable behavior. One of the main reasons victims, as has been said, are afraid to come forward is fear of re-victimization, fear of re-traumatization. As more stories of sexual harassment and sexual assault are told, we must ensure that survivors are heard and that we are ready to support them. I want to commend Mia Kirshner, Freya, Aisling, and everyone in this room for bringing this critical issue to light. I want to acknowledge your bravery. By coming forward with your own experiences, you have ignited a spark that helped make these discussions possible. You created a space where survivors can lend their voice to yours. So thank you. And to all of you, to my colleagues in Ottawa, to my fellow Canadians, I ask, will you create this space for dialogue in your home, at your workplace, a space where healing and learning can take place? Will you treat survivors with compassion and respect? Will you listen to them without judgment? So throughout my career, first as a Crown prosecutor, then as a treaty commissioner and the regional chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations, I heard many of these stories and saw firsthand the devastating impact that sexual assault can have on victims and survivors, who are disproportionately women. Sadly, I have seen this violence occur in every corner of every space that I have occupied. But I have also seen leadership in the face of such violence. So I'm fortunate to come from a very loving and supportive family. My grandmother, Pugladi, raised my sister and me to know where we came from, to know who we are, and to work hard for our success. She ensured that we knew our culture, our values, the laws of the big house, and how to conduct oneself as a leader. Her values and perspectives, like mine, were formed being born into the Eagle Clan of the Musqueam, Tsawwadenak, and Liquiqua people, part of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation of northern Vancouver Island. We are a matrilineal society. Matrilineal meaning that property descends through the female line. In our system, I am Haligilasti, a role always held by women. One of my jobs is to lead my Hamatsa, the chief, into the big house. This role can be translated into one that corrects the chief's path. We show them the way. A metaphor for life, perhaps some food for thought for today, and in the potlatch symbolized in our rituals where now symbolically the power of the Hamatsa is tamed and he becomes ready to be chief. So my grandmother used to always joke that with us that when it came to the respective roles of women and men, that women were far too busy and important to be chiefs. Kind of a joke, but not really. We come from a communitarian culture. Everybody in our culture, in our society, has a role to play in making the community work well. The roles are very different, but equally important in terms of ensuring the community functions the way that it should. I call it balance. In fact, our whole system is about balance between men and women, between clans, and between tribes. These are the teachings that I bring and have brought to every role that I've held. So now, as Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada, I know, and most importantly, I accept that I have a role to play in stopping violence. I understand, or I undertake to leave the criminal justice system and the judiciary better equipped to address sexual violence in Canada. Along with my colleagues, I am committed to taking bold steps to reduce sexual violence and harassment and to ensure that survivors are treated with respect and dignity. Many hold the view, understandably, that the law has failed victims of sexual violence. But it is not the laws on the books that have failed us. From a legal standpoint, as I know there's many lawyers in this room, Canada has some of the strongest laws in the world when it comes to sexual assault. Our criminal code clearly prohibits sexual assault in all its forms. Sexual assault being any physical contact with somebody without their consent that is of a sexual nature. The criminal code defines consent as the voluntary agreement to the sexual activity in question and clearly sets out circumstances where the law will not recognize consent. such as where the complainant consents because of threats or violence. Where an accused claims that they honestly but mistakenly believe that the complainant had consented, they must show that they took reasonable steps to ascertain that consent. These laws were not always as strong. Before 1983, the credibility of complainants in sexual assault cases could be attacked by asking them questions about their sexual history to suggest that they were less worthy of belief or more likely to have consented because of their sexual history. These are known as the twin myths. These myths were and continue to be a byproduct of misogyny, and they have been so endemic to the justice system that they required legislation to put an end to their use. The rape shield provisions in the criminal code now ensure that the use of evidence related to sexual history is strictly circumscribed. No longer can inferences and stereotypes about sexual assault victims be used as part of defense. These amendments to the code, along with others, protect complainants from assumptions based on myths and stereotypes about how victims of sexual assault are expected to behave. This legislation, however, was not enough. It took renowned jurists to uphold and breathe life into the law. Indeed, Justice Sheila Martin, who was recently nominated by the Prime Minister of Canada to the Supreme Court of Canada, argued before that very court in Regina and Mills, seeking to uphold the constitutionality of the rape shield provisions in the face of a charter challenge. She succeeded. And yet, despite being upheld, the rape shield provisions in the criminal code have not adequately increased the rates of charging, prosecution, or conviction in sexual assault cases. They are significantly lower than any other type of violent crime. Let me share with you a shameful statistic. It is estimated that only 5% of sexual assaults are reported to police. For those that are reported, 37% resulted in charges in 2016. And in 2015-16, 44% of accused were ultimately, who ultimately appeared in adult court in sexual assault cases were found guilty. This means that less than 1% of those accused of sexual assault in Canada were convicted or are convicted. Less than 1%. This is the lowest conviction rate for any type of violent crime in this country. This cannot stand. We must work together to combat the underlying factors that contribute to this broken system. Over the last year, media reports, particularly the Globe and Mail's award-winning investigative series, have highlighted a number of cases, an unacceptable high number, that police deemed unfounded, and the reasons why. Victims of sexual assault still face significant barriers in reporting assaults, as we've heard, to police and testifying in court. Perhaps the greatest barrier that victims face are the myths and stereotypes that surround gender-based violence, which continue to surface at all stages of the criminal justice system. Indigenous, transgender, two-spirit, disabled, and other marginalized survivors of sexual assault face further barriers to justice, compounded by additional myths and stereotypes. Victims are re-victimized, and the cycle of silence and violence continues. So where do we go from here? The first step is starting broad social dialogue, like the one we're having today. Survivors must be able to assert their right to be heard and must be able to talk about it in safe places. The second step is ensuring that our criminal justice system works. Every actor across Canada's criminal justice system must have the tools needed to better understand and apply the law. This includes specialized training on sexual assault law for police and Crown prosecutors, training for judges, and training for lawyers who wish to join the judiciary. This is why our government funded critical training for federal and provincial judges on gender-based violence, including sexual assault and domestic violence. And while our laws are strong, they can be strengthened. This is why we have sought to clarify and strengthen the sexual assault provisions in the Criminal Code through Bill C-51. Specifically, the system must understand that the rape shield provisions apply to sexual communications. But having strong laws on the books, as we have seen, is not always enough. We also need to look at new approaches. We must look beyond changes to the letter of the law for solutions and examine why the law is not being applied and enforced as it should. It requires creating a system of public accountability for this type of violence, which brings me to the third step: transparency and accountability. Statistics on the prevalence of sexual violence must be brought to the public's attention. Statistics Canada is now putting into place a standardized process for collecting and using quality statistics on unfounded criminal incidences, including sexual assaults. The importance of this data, as has been stated, cannot be overemphasized. To effect change, we must understand the contours and causes of this violence. The Unfounded series also highlighted ways in which the system for reporting and investigating sexual assaults and violence could be improved, such as the model developed in Philadelphia. As I've said in the past, I support such models to promote greater transparency and accountability, and our office has funded a pilot project in North Bay, which is based on the Philadelphia model. The fourth step in this journey is acknowledging that we do need to do more for survivors. This includes making sure our practices in dealing with survivors reflect an understanding of how trauma affects the brain and the ability to recall events. Per Bill C-51, complainants must have the right to a lawyer in the courtroom when the court is determining whether to allow evidence of the complainant's sexual history to be admitted. This initiative, among others, that we have brought forward, underscores the importance of treating victims with compassion in a manner that better meets the needs of vulnerable peoples and one that takes a more integrated approach to addressing and preventing crime. There are, of course, other needs as well. The better we understand and meet the needs of victims of crime, the more just and fair our criminal justice system will become. And this brings me to the last step in our journey together, a commitment that reaffirms my conviction every day. To stop sexual violence, we must stop sexism, misogyny, and discrimination. This requires breaking patterns of behavior that are at the core of the problem within our society. At all levels, we need to commit to achieving equality, denouncing discrimination, empowering vulnerable communities, tackling ongoing sexism, homophobia, transphobia in all its forms, and to ensure that everyone can live their full potential. When Prime Minister Trudeau spoke at the United Nations General Assembly recently, he reaffirmed that Canada is one of the most diverse, peaceful, democratic, respectful, and cohesive nations on earth. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms reflects these values and beliefs. And because of the Charter, we are all equal before and under the law, regardless of who we are, where we come from, or who we love. And as we celebrate its 35th anniversary this year, we also celebrate what it means to be Canadian. Each of us can be a force for progress, compassion, and fairness, both in Canada and around the world. As Minister of Justice and Attorney General, it is my job to ensure our laws and our programs reflect these values. For example, we must ensure that the families of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls have their questions answered from government agencies. We must fund culturally grounded, trauma-informed services to support Indigenous victims and survivors of crime, as my department has done across the country. The cycle of violence must end. And within our own house, we must ensure that federally regulated workplaces, including Parliament Hill, are free from harassment and sexual violence. I'm incredibly proud of the steps that my colleague, Minister Patty Hajdu, took last month to address sexual harassment in the workplace and on the Hill. And although I'm proud to be a part of a federal cabinet that is gender balanced, only 1 in 4 members of Parliament are female. This is unacceptable. We must continue to work promptly and decisively towards true gender equality in all spheres of society. And at a global level, Canada has a role to play. But we must lead by example. And when we do, we must help to seek to eliminate barriers everywhere and elsewhere, addressing the challenges that prevent women and girls from reaching their full potential. Women must be empowered to improve their lives and those of their families, communities, and countries, whether here at home or abroad. Simply put, empowering women and girls empowers humanity. It creates balance in society, ensuring that we are firing on all cylinders. Last month, our government released Canada's second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. The action plan will guide Canada's efforts over the next 5 years to advance the role of women and girls and to protect their human rights in fragile, conflict, or post-conflict countries and in all stages of peace. So as we reflect and look forward, in many ways and for many people who have been unfairly treated or ignored as part of the national conversation, the tide is turning. This is a day of reckoning. The flywheel is in motion, and let us use this momentum for real change. So I will ask, what happens after we say, "I hear you," or "You deserve more," or "Me too," or "I pledge to end sexual violence and harassment"? What happens after we acknowledge that women and girls and members of vulnerable communities are equal? How do we translate belief into action? For the conversation does not end there, a fact that has been brought into sharp relief by a story told to me by my father, Bill Wilson, a story that was televised nationally. So in 1983, during the constitutional conferences on Aboriginal self-government, my father, a well-known Indigenous leader, told then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, quote, "I have 2 children in Vancouver Island, both of whom, for some misguided reason, say they want to be lawyers, both of whom want to be the Prime Minister." This statement elicited chuckles in the room. Unbelievably, however, these chuckles turned into outright laughter when my father said, "Both of whom, Prime Minister, are women." The audience laughed at the notion that a woman, let alone an Indigenous woman, could ever be Prime Minister. The audience laughed at the dreams of young Indigenous girls. The audience laughed at my father's conviction that his daughters deserved a seat at the table. I love my father and I love his convictions. His comments and the audience's reaction highlighted the barriers faced by women, especially Indigenous women. That was 1983. I like to think that we have come a long way since then, and in many ways we certainly have. I am here as Mojag, working for an amazing feminist Prime Minister, and you are all here. But what is troubling still is that below the surface, the vestiges of intolerance still linger, manifesting themselves at times into overt harassment and outright violence. And this must be of concern to all of us. So in conclusion, and in addition to listening to survivors and building on the commitment I talked about earlier, we must always speak out against sexual harassment and violence, intervene when we see acts of gender-based violence, when we can do so safely, take action by creating space for these discussions in our communities, Lead by example and know that your words and actions matter. Your voice matters. Like the government's 16 days of activism against gender-based violence initiative, an initiative that will end on December the 10th, I urge you to continue to affirm that everyone has the right to live a life free of violence. We must all take action to end gender-based violence. We must acknowledge our collective responsibility. We must move together towards inclusivity. Broader societal forces create and influence attitudes, and while they created the prevalence of gender-based violence, they will also end it. We will tame the hametza, and we will achieve balance. Those attitudes that condoned harassment and violence, resulting in a culture of silence that muted the denunciation of perpetrators, are yielding to new societal forces. Courage and compassion are the strengths that have broken the silence. These strengths run deep in those who have come forward in recent weeks to recount in detail their stories of harassment and abuse in the workplace, at home, and throughout society. Some only felt comfortable to say "me too." All of them are asking, in their way, to acknowledge them. And we do, we must, and all of them are counting on us to take action after Me Too to ensure that the culture of violence and harassment ends. And we will, we must. Galakasla, thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you for your leadership in this regard.